Every shock that brings us close to death has three things in common. Now, a bushfire is different to a flood. A riot is not like a plague. But throughout all of time and history, anyone going through one of these crises will experience the same three moments. 1. The breakdown of hierarchy. 2. Moment of calm. 3. The respite. The first time I experienced these moments was when I was 16 years old, during the first real shock of my life. And every crisis I've lived through since then takes me back to that day. April 1999, Boulder, Colorado. I was smoking weed in the car park of Fairview High School when I first overheard two other stoner kids talking about it. You hear there's something happening over at Columbine High School this afternoon? Oh, on South Pierce Street, what do you mean? I don't know, all the police are over there. Maybe there's a fire? Anyway, they've evacuated all the students. Those lucky motherfuckers. So that's what we should do. Pull the fire alarm and get the rest of the afternoon off. So I was too stoned to understand what they were talking about. I just knew that Columbine was the neighbouring town a few miles to the northeast. But later that afternoon and into the night, on the TV, radio, on the internet, the story came out in confused, unclear bursts. There'd been a bombing. No, there'd been an intruder who shot students. No, it was students themselves who'd been shooting. Two of the goth kids in the trenchcoat mafia had murdered their classmates. It's 3 students dead. No, it's 5. No, it's 9. No, it's more. It's friends and family members of students that I knew. The 24 hours that followed the shooting laid down the template for every shock I've experienced since. 1. The breakdown of hierarchy. And when I arrived at school the morning after the shooting, mood was tense. In the corridors, the jocks talked about beating up the goths in revenge if they dared show up to school. I wasn't a goth, but I was friends with some of them. They'd always been nice to the weird Australian transfer kid, so I kept my head down and I tried to stay out of sight. The goths, wisely enough, stayed home. In class, the teachers talked to us about the shooting, trying to place these horrific events in context, trying to reassure us. But as the day wore on, it became clear that they had no idea what to say. My world-weary history teacher, Mr. Kincaid, was used to convincing his classes of counterintuitive things. A week before, he had gently broken it to us that the USA had in fact lost the Vietnam War, to the general disbelief of half my classmates. But he struggled to convince us that we had nothing to worry about in the event of a follow-up shooting. He said, you see, if someone tried to come through the door to this classroom, we'd just lock it here, and then they'd have to shoot through the window, which means they couldn't hit you students here. It would just be the kids at the back of the room. You would be in the line of fire. And so you'd all hide under your desks, which would shield you, except for these 2 rows here, you'd be exposed. But then, of course, if they shot out the window, they could unlock the door and enter, and then, really, at that point, I don't know what I'd do. And he continued on in this dazed monotone, and we glanced at each other, we glanced back at his red-rimmed eyes, and we realized that he hadn't slept all night. Drama class was no better. My drama teacher, Miss Horton, was this cheerful eccentric with frizzy hair and amazing fake tan who told her students gossipy stories about 1930s Broadway stars as if they'd happened yesterday. But when we arrived in the drama classroom today, she launched into a furious tirade. So I don't want to blame anyone, but we know for a fact whose fault this is. It's this film, The Matrix. Did you realize it's got a scene in it where 2 people wearing trench coats walk into an office building and start shooting people with machine guns? Now, how else could those kids have gotten that idea? They should arrest Keanu Reeves today. He's responsible for this. And as Miss Horton railed on, her voice cracked and her eyes blinked with tears, and I realized suddenly that behind the anger she was scared, confused, unsure, terrified. It became clear that these teachers had no explanation, no assurances, no understanding. They were as lost as the rest of us. And gradually, the attempts at lecturing us stuttered to a halt. They stopped telling us how it was, and instead they asked us how we were, and they confessed to how helpless and overwhelmed they felt. The hierarchy dissolved. Suddenly, we weren't teachers and students anymore. We were just a group of people trying to process something awful together. Now, in every crisis I've experienced since then, the same thing has happened. At first, as the fires spread or the floods start to rise, the pundits and the blowhards talk louder and louder to convince us that they understand what's happening. And then as the scale of the shock becomes clear, it becomes obvious that they have no idea. And gradually, with no discussion needed, people stop listening. The hierarchies come down. The pundits are ignored, forgotten about. By the time the fire front is visible, by the time the rising waters knock out the power grid, there are no leaders. We're just people helping each other out, human to human. 2. The moment of calm. The second moment that comes with every shock is the moment of calm. In the midst of the chaos and noise, when the threat really escalates, there comes a sudden stillness, quietness, and with it, clarity. The day after the shooting, the moment of calm came during 5th period French. We were sitting at our desks, trying and failing to focus on translating a chapter of Candide, when an announcement came over the school loudspeaker. Teachers, please check your stations. Miss Panettiere told us all to stay in our seats, and without saying a word, she got up, walked out of the classroom, began walking up and down the corridor outside. We were unsure what was happening until Damon, the kid to my left, whispered, "Shit, someone's planted a bomb." No one spoke. We watched Miss Panettiere through the open classroom door. On the opposite side of the corridor, someone had left a jacket. We all saw it at the same moment, and the same thought entered all of our heads. That's it. There it is. Miss Panettiere approached the discarded jacket very slowly. She knelt down. While we held our breaths, she carefully lifted the jacket up. Just a jacket. But as she stood up, there was another announcement on the loudspeaker. Teachers, please lead your students out of the school in a quiet, orderly manner. So, someone had found something. Whatever this was, it was real, it was happening, and we might not make it out of school alive. I thought, okay, we're going to die. But I didn't feel frightened or panicked. Instead, it was a sense of stillness or sudden clarity. And Damon gave me a grin, and we got up and we patiently filed out of the classroom. Every crisis I've lived through since that day, I've felt at some point that same sudden calm. When the fire jumped the road in front of my car, or when the taxi started filling up with water in the flooding streets, I felt that stillness and quiet, that sudden clear realization that death is very close, that death has always been there, right there, close enough to touch. Not a scary feeling, but maybe a slightly melancholy one. And then, as we made our way out of the fire exit behind the French classes, the moment passed, and the chaos and the panic rose up in me again. 3. The respite. The last moment that every crisis has in common is the moment after the immediate danger has passed. It's the sensation of the aftermath, of respite, of escape. So after we evacuated the high school, we stood on Fairview High's front lawn. 1,000 students, still in shock, waiting uncertainly for the all clear to go back inside. But after a few minutes, Damon said, "Nah, fuck this. That's enough. I'm going home." He picked up his bag and he walked away. One by one, without saying anything, other students followed. First a few, then a few more, then hundreds of teenagers crossing the road or walking over the sports field. The teachers watched us go and said nothing. And at last, I picked up my bag and did the same. And I remember vividly the feeling of walking home that afternoon. There's a sensation I felt in the aftermath of every other shock I've lived through. When the flames die down and you look around and see no new embers flying. When the floodwaters in the streets drop to waist height and then to knee height. When you know that the worst is past and you're somehow still alive. The bomb threat at Fairview High School that day was a hoax. Turns out there was no danger of death. But the feeling of relief I felt on the way home, that was absolutely real. And what's the name for that feeling? Respite, or escape, or reprieve. Or maybe it's just the sensation of adrenaline passing out of the system. But it's peaceful like nothing else I've ever known. Now someday there'll be a crisis where that feeling doesn't come, where there is no aftermath, no escape, no relief. Someday the fires won't subside, the waters won't recede, the bomb threat will be real. Until that day, whenever I feel that sensation of danger passing, of crisis temporarily averted, I flash back to that afternoon and how I felt on that walk home. The sunlight, cold wind off the Rockies, the cliffs of the Flatirons rising over the city, the clear Colorado sky.